All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started with our first speaker, Dr. Trevor DeVries. While growing up in British Columbia, Dr. DeVries often visited his uncle's dairy farm, sparking a lifelong interest in dairy cows. His interest in animal science continued as an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, where he had the opportunity to participate in dairy cow research. That led to an interest in nutritional management, animal welfare, and behavior, which he studied during his graduate program at UBC. Dr. DeVries then completed a one-year postdoctoral position with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Lethbridge Research Centre. In 2007, he began his academic position at the University of Guelph's Kemptville campus, where he worked for 8 years before coming to the main campus in 2015. He's now a Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behavior and Welfare. His research focuses on identifying factors that influence the development of dairy cattle behavior patterns and the physiological consequences of those behaviors. Through his research, Dr. DeVries aims to develop best practices for nutrition, housing, and management that promote healthy behavioral patterns in dairy cattle and are conducive to good health, production, and welfare. This morning, Dr. DeVries will be talking to us about managing cows in robot barns for best behavior, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Gail, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizing committee for the invite to present today as part of this virtual dairy nutrition and management series. And it's a pleasure to speak on this topic area of managing cows in robot barns for best behavior. And probably one of the reasons why this topic is of interest, not only to myself, but to probably many of you, is the fact that we've seen a large uptick in the adoption of robotic or automated milking within the dairy industry over the past number of years. Even in more difficult financial times, we still see that adoption growing within the industry. And so it begs the question of why we're seeing that and what benefits that robotic or automated milking is providing to dairy producers. And that was actually a question that we started asking a few years ago as we saw the numbers, particularly in Canada, growing quite quickly in terms of the number of farms adopting this technology. And so we conducted a large survey study a few years back already with over 200 producers in Canada to explore why they were seeing, or why we're seeing such an increase in this adoption. And when we asked producers about kind of their perceptions of transition into robotic milking, we got a number of different responses from them in terms of the benefits that they observed on their farms. And a few of them I think would probably be expected, a few of them maybe not as expected. With the adoption of robotic milking, we have obviously a greater potential for greater milking frequency, particularly at certain times in lactation, maybe early lactation where we want to see that, associated increases in yields, potential for improved cow health and reproduction, potential for greater herd management, and with that comes greater data and use of that data in terms of making management decisions. Probably the one that most people would expect was less and or more flexible use of labor, and that's been fairly well studied and identified in the industry. And then finally, there's also a perception from producers that the use of robotic technology not only has a potential to improve their profitability, which again is going to depend on a variety of factors that contribute to that, but also quality of life. And that's interesting because we actually explored that in a little bit more detail in some questions that we asked of those producers. And one of the things that we noted was that their response, when asked on a scale of 1 to 5 of strongly disagreeing to strongly agreeing, whether or not the adoption of robotic milking had, say, improved their profitability, met their expectations, improved their quality of life, is that they were generally very positive, and particularly when it came to questions of quality of life, where they overwhelmingly suggested that the move to robotic milking had improved their quality of life. And what was probably even more interesting is that in addition to their own quality of life, they rated the improvement in their cows' quality of life just as high as their own quality of life. And so that then again begs the question of what are these benefits? We went through that list of things that probably are mostly beneficial to the producer. So the question becomes, well, what is the benefit then for the cows themselves that are milked in these systems? And so again, not a question that we can ask directly of the cows, but we have to look to some of the indicators that the cows are telling us when kept in these systems, as far as improvements that may be related to them in those systems. And probably the most obvious and easy one for us to think of is the potential for better health. And that's, again, something that producers have identified as being potentially there for their cows, specifically the greater use and of technology and associated sensors with that technology. The data is allowing for, say, earlier health event detection, say earlier intervention strategies, and as a result of that, we're able to take advantage of that and have improvements with that. The other thing that potentially can get identified for the cows then is more behavioral freedom as a direct benefit to the cows, and specifically as we're giving cows basically more autonomy, specifically in their milking behavior, but then also in their other behaviors, whether it be feeding, whether it be lying, whether it be drinking. That autonomy in their behavior should have benefits for those cows as well, and we should be able to take advantage of those in our management of cows in these systems. Now, again, probably the best way to address what is good behavior in robotic milking barns is probably to think about what are the impediments to that good behavior. And so what are things that are going to prevent cows from displaying that good behavior within the systems that they're kept? And that's really what I would like to do with this presentation here this morning, is talk about specifically what things, whether they be housing, management, nutrition, may be influencing the behavior of cows on robotic farms, and some of the challenges that may exist there, but also some of the opportunities that we have in these systems. And three things that I specifically kind of want to go through are situations that are going to influence the behavior of cows, specifically situations where cows cannot milk when they want to, so influencing that voluntary nature of milking. Related to that as well, say cows that don't want to go milk, and so again, that's a behavioral kind of impediment on those animals. And then lastly, the third thing I'll walk through is some examples related to improper nutritional management that then also trickles down to really that desire for cows to not only spend the time they need to, say, eating and maintaining good intake, but also how that then ties into their milking behavior, which is, again, key in a robotic milking system as far as making sure those cows can meet their production requirements there as well. So the first examples that I want to go through are related to situations where cows cannot milk when they want to. And again, there's going to be a variety of different things that are going to influence that situation. Most of those, or to a large degree, those are going to be influenced by barn design and management. And within that, a variety of different factors. And I'd like to just walk through a few different examples of what might be very specific to robotic barns, which may have an influence on that behavior. And probably the first and biggest one that comes to mind when we think about robotic milking systems is, how do we set up barns to allow for good flow of cows to the robot as well as to the other resources? So allowing the cows to devote the time, the behavior that they need to things like eating, things like lying down, drinking, as well as that milking behavior. And we generally see within the dairy industry kind of two broader categories of how cows are kept in robotic barns. And the one side on the left here is our free traffic barns, where cows are basically given free access to the robots. And so from where cows are lying down or whether they're at the feed bunk, they can access the robot without any kind of restriction as far as one-way gates or selection gates, and really have kind of full autonomy on when they can visit that robot. Also within the industry, we see a lot of what we call guided traffic barns. And in guided traffic systems, cows typically have to pass through the robot through a selection gate that's either going to tell them to be milked, or if they're not due for milking based on, say, time interval or expected production level, then they'll be moved on to the other resource. And sometimes that might be moving from, say, the feed alley through the robot back to the lying stalls, and we call that a feed first guided type system. Or it might be the opposite, where the cows pass from the lying area within the barn through a selection gate either to the robot or to the feed bunk, and in that case we call that a milk first type system, where they go through that robot first before getting to the feed bunk. Now, again, lots of questions in terms of the industry as far as what system is optimal, and specifically from a cow behavior standpoint. And one of the points that I like to make is that we see a lot of all types of systems within the industry, and for the most part, the success in those systems comes down to how the cows are managed within those systems. And so really no conclusive evidence in terms of which system is best from kind of a cow behavior and milking visit production standpoint. That being said, we do have some studies to suggest that there can be specific challenges within these systems. And one of the older studies that I'd like to highlight is some work from Spain, from Dr. Alex Bach, where they're looking at a direct comparison of forced traffic, in this case, a milk first type system, and a free traffic type system. And one of the things that they noted within their study was the fact that in a milk first type system, where the cows have to pass through that robot before getting to the feed bunk, there is a potential for kind of a bottleneck at that selection gate, where either cows may be queuing up there, or due to, say, dominance reasons, they might not want to go through that selection gate. And as a result of that, the number of passes through that gate becomes reduced. And as a result of that, you see actually fewer meals per day of those cows at the feed bunk, because basically every meal that cow's having is directly correlated with how often that cow is going through, say, that selection gate and going to the feed bunk. And as a result of that, they even noted a slight reduction in terms of PMR consumption in those cows as a result of say, fewer passes and fewer visits to the feed bunk. And regardless of that, even if they weren't having as much, what that ends up being then is fewer meals, larger meals, greater risk of kind of that slug feeding behavior, which from a rumen health standpoint, we'd really like to try to avoid. From a milking behavior standpoint, again, early on, a lot of people suggested that having a guided type traffic system is going to avoid the need to, say, fetch as many cows, and may actually result in say, greater milking frequency. But again, from studies that are out there, not a lot of conclusive evidence on that, and field studies that actually exist, we actually, in some cases, see the opposite. And just wanted to highlight some very recent data that one of my students has put together in a study that we completed with 75 farms in Ontario, Canada, of which disproportionately, most of them are actually free traffic systems. And this is a fairly random sample of herds within our province. So we're looking at about 10% of the herds milking with guided traffic systems. And this was actually part of a larger study of 200 farms from across Canada, where that number fits pretty well right in where we're about 12% guided traffic systems and about 88% free traffic systems. And what we observed within our 75 hertz here in Ontario is that within our free traffic systems, we actually see more milking visits per day, equivalent of close to about 0.4, so 0.37 extra milking visits per day for those farms that are milking with free traffic. And when modeling this out, looking at the influence of milking visits on milk yield on those farms, that's the equivalent of about 2.1 kilos or close to 5 pounds extra milk yield associated with those greater milking visits. And so potentially there is some benefits from a visit from a production standpoint in those free traffic systems. Now, again, I like to make the point though that when we're thinking about it specifically from the cow's behavior standpoint, if we're going to ask that question, which is best, the take home still in my mind is that both can work very well with good management. And that's something that we need to highlight and make sure people are aware of. But then at the same time, realize that when management is not optimal, there's probably greater risk for the cows in a guided traffic system where they're going to be at risk of, say, having fewer meals per day, through fewer passes through, say, selection gates to the robot, to the feed bunk, or vice versa, longer waiting times, longer standing times, things that have a negative impact on their behavioral patterns. Whereas in a free traffic system, the greater risk is actually for farmers. If cows aren't motivated to go to the robot because of management, then the producers themselves are going to have to spend more time fetching cows and figuring that out. And so then the question becomes, is whose behavior is easier to manage? And in my opinion, again, I like to put the cows first. And so if we take care of the cows' behavior first, then we can deal with the producer's behavior after. And so again, my personal bias would be to minimizing that risk, say in a free traffic system versus a guided traffic system, and work from there and work on our management from that standpoint. Another management related and housing, I guess, related factor that it may influence the ability of cows to milk when they want to is barn density, and specifically robot density. For the most part, however, we don't see a lot of challenges here within the industry. Early on, suggestion was made that we could be milking 60, 70 cows in our robotic milking systems, and that number has been tempered over the last number of years as we realize kind of how that influences the behavior of the cows in the barns. And just as one example of that, a survey study we did a few years back of farms in Canada, over 40 farms, looking at stocking density at the robot, and the average number of cows per robotic unit was about 50 cows, so 49 cows, ranging from 30 to 63. And so nobody really pushing the higher upper limits of that robot density. But even within that range, even though we're below, say, that 60 cows, we still see an association with the ability of the cows to get to the robot, whereby milking frequency is directly tied to how many cows are at the robot. And so in this case, across that range, there's about a 0.22 milking visits per every 10 cows per unit difference. So say across that range there, we multiply that out, that's about 0.6 milking visits per day, 0.7 milking visits per day difference per cow per day based on the density of cows at the robot. And so again, something that producers need to be aware of in terms of making sure that if we're trying to hit a certain target in terms of milking visits, specifically even within certain stages of lactation, we need to be cognizant of the number of cows that are on those units. And for the most part, like I mentioned, we don't have an issue. This is just one example. A lot of other studies that have surveyed farms, both in Canada as well as the US, have typically found that number to hover in the high 40s and low 50s in terms of number of cows per robotic unit. It's only when we start to get very high numbers would we end up with more troublesome results from that. And this is just to highlight, this is some older data that comes from Canada, but just suggesting that as we really move beyond kind of that 60 cows per robotic unit, that's when we really start to increase the risk of having to fetch cows to that robot, and we're going to see the number of voluntary milkings severely go down in those situations. Another factor related to density would be stall stocking density, and I'll come back to this in a few moments as well. But it's interesting to note that in a lot of the farms that we're dealing with that have robotic milking, that stocking density is not a huge issue from a stall standpoint, with the average being actually under 100%. However, still quite a bit of variation there from some farms, very low stocking, to some farms that are overcrowding their pens a little bit. But what's interesting there is that not only the stocking density at the robot is going to influence their milking behavior, but what we found was that stall stocking density was also associated with milking behavior, in that within our study, we found that every extra 10 cows per free stall was associated with basically fetching an extra cow per day, suggesting that, again, the behavior at the free stall, which we know is influenced by stall stocking density, when they lie down, how much time they spend lying down, is going to be directly tied to when those cows get up and milk as well. And again, I probably should have highlighted this earlier, is that, and I'll come back to this later in the presentation as well, one of the things that we know is that those behaviors are all inherently tied together in a robotic facility. And so when they lie down, when they eat, are also going to be highly tied to when those cows milk. And so if the cows can't devote the time they need to lying down, especially at times when they want to, that then potentially is going to have a negative influence on their voluntary milking behavior as well. Tied in with this question then is a question about feed bunk stocking density. And this is an interesting one as well, as again, the discussions being largely through the years in terms of, because of the idea that in a robotic facility, we may have, say, less synchrony of behavior of cows. Cows have that behavioral freedom, maybe a bit more autonomy in terms of their behavior when they do certain things. Maybe we can get away with, say, not having as much space at certain resources like the feed bunk, because they might not be eating all at the same time like you would see in a conventional system. And again, not a lot of great data to support this either way. Quite difficult actually to study in controlled studies. We have actually looked at this in some of our survey work, just looking at what's going on in the field and how that's associated with some of the outcome metrics that we have on farms that are using robotic milking. And it's interesting to point out that some of our results are actually kind of opposite of what many people would predict. And the first results I'd like to highlight is a fairly small study that comes from 2011, a study of robotic farms here in Ontario, Canada, where at the time, when we looked at a small cohort of farms, we found that the average amount of space available at the feed bunk for cows was quite good. It was almost 28 inches of space, so much higher than kind of that 24, 2 feet expectation that we'd have in a lot of our freestall barns, conventional milk barns. But a lot of variation there around that. So that ranged from as low as, say, 12 inches per cow up to over 3 feet or 39 inches of space per cow. What was interesting in this data set is that when we then across farms correlated or associated that input as with some production outputs and behavioral outputs on those farms, what we found was that for every 4-inch or 10-centimeter increase in bunk space, we saw an associated increase in milk yield as well as lying time in the cows. And so almost 4 pounds extra milk per 4 inches of bunk space, and about 0.4 hours of lying duration per cow per day. So like close to 24 minutes of extra lying time per cow per day with more bunk space. And those are likely, I would assume, associated as we give cows more space. And I'll come back to another example where if cows can use their time more efficiently at the feed bunk, if there's more space available to them there, and they don't have to spend time standing around waiting for searching for feed. They're going to be able to use their time more efficiently at the bunk, as well as devote more time to lying down, which we also know is going to be correlated with how much time they effectively spend ruminating, which may have a trickle-down effect on how quickly they may return to eating, eat more, potentially produce more milk, and that might actually explain why we see this associated production difference with greater amounts of feed bunk space on these robot herds. And in support of this, in a more recent study that we've done, we actually see a very similar association. And so this is a very recent study that my student, Robert Matson, is working on, finishing up right now, where we went on 197 robot farms from across Canada, and similarly looking at bunk space availability on these farms. And what Robert found was a mean of about 25 inches or 64 centimeters per cow. And in this case, every 4 inches in bunk space was also associated with greater milk yield on these farms. In this case, about 0.66 pounds per day. And so one of the things that you'll notice is a drastic difference in terms of the kind of magnitude of association. And so again, more space, not still associated with milk production, but not the same level or degree. And probably the difference there is, and I'll come back to this later, is probably the difference in feed bunk management that's happened over the years. Whereas in our 2011 study, a lot of those farms were feeding once, twice a day, only pushing up feed a limited number of times per day. Whereas in this study, what we're finding is that the average feed delivery frequency is anywhere from 2 to 3 times per day or greater. Lots of farms using automated feed delivery systems, as well as a high proportion of farms using automated feed push-up. And so the average feed push-up on these farms is anywhere from 10 to 15 times per day, with many farms doing it on the hour. And so that greater feed availability due to better feeding management probably tempering this to some degree as well. So the question then becomes is, can we get away with less space at the feed bunk in robotic barns? And that's a question that has been asked for a number of years, and I'm still getting that question from a number of people from around the world that are looking at robotic milking facilities. And really, to date, there's no evidence to suggest that we can actually get away with less space. And so it's not something that I would ever make a recommendation on. However, I think there are probably situations where it may be manageable. I probably shouldn't even say okay, but I should say manageable or more manageable. And potentially that's in milk first guided traffic barns, where we may not have as much of a slug, say, of cows that go to the feed bunk at one time. Again, that has to become with, say, good feeding management. Maybe in situations where only forage is provided at the feed bunk and not a PMR. But again, very infrequent event and not necessarily a recommended kind of nutritional practice on robot farms. And then again, tying in with good feeding management is potential with situations where you have high frequency of feed delivery, maybe automated TMR mixing delivery systems combined with regimented good feed push-up. In those situations, maybe as well with continuous access, we can potentially tighten the amount of space at the feed bunk a little bit. But again, no direct evidence to suggest that that is really the case. The next thing I want to jump into is to briefly talk about situations where cows don't want to go milk. And again, that's a behavioral impact. So when cows can't get to the robot, or they don't have that desire to go to the robot, again, their behavior is impeded, and that voluntary milking aspect is not going to occur on our robot farms. And probably the one classic example of this on robot farms is situations where we have cows that are lame. And obviously lameness is a sign of pain, typically in the foot or something in the leg or hip of the cows, which is going to impede their normal gait. It's going to have a negative impact on their ability to walk, and specifically in a robot barn, their desire to get to the robot. It's also important to note that the prevalence of lameness to date in our robot farms is not that much different than what we see in our conventional freestall milking barns. And so this is data from one of our grad students from a few years back, Dr. Megan King, who looked at lameness prevalence in Canadian robotic milking farms. And what she found was the average prevalence was about 26%, which falls very closely in line with many of our other estimates of lameness prevalence in conventional freestall barns as well. Even though that average is there, what we see is a lot of variation. So some farms doing very well with low prevalence rates, and then some farms doing less well. And as a result of that, we're able to potentially identify differences between those farms based on some of those differences in prevalence rates as well. Now, I should point out that when I say lameness prevalence here, this is any cow that's really walking with a gait abnormality. And so on a scale of 1 to 5 on a gait score system, we're looking at cows with a gait score of, say, 3 or higher, falling into this categorization. When we look at only those cows with very severe lameness, so those kind of 3-legged, severely limping cows, then we actually see a much better picture within our robotic milking dairies, and that our average is actually very low, just over 2%, with a large number of farms with no severe lameness prevalence at all. And again, I think in a robotic milking facility, these cows become even more obvious. And so the ability of producers to pick those cows out becomes even greater. And thus those cows are either treated or removed from the herd at an earlier standpoint than they may be, say, in our other conventional milking type systems. Regardless, we still have an issue with the number of cows that may be having some level of lameness, and that doesn't then come without a price within our robotic milking farms. And that's something, again, that Megan explored as part of her research, was the fact that these cows that are lame, even though they're mostly mildly lame or walking with just a slight gait impediment, that's still having a negative impact on those cows' desire to milk voluntarily. And as a result of that, what she found, and again in this data set, which is close to about 1,200 cows, we see that those cows that were classified as lame were about 2.2 times more likely to be fetched on any given day than, say, a sound cow was in those herds. And as a result of that, we see a difference in how often those cows are actually being milked per day, where those lame cows are milking about 0.3 times less often per day, and that's associated with lesser milk production. In the case of this study, about a 1.6 kilogram difference in milk production, which is close to about 3.5 pounds less milk. And that's significant, again, because in a lot of our estimates of differences in milk production between, say, mildly lame cows and sound cows, we don't necessarily see huge differences in milk production. But I think that's accentuated in robotic milking farms, where if those cows are lame, they're milking less voluntarily, they're milking less often. And as a result of that, we see the difference in milk production between those cows. Question then that needs to be answered is, well, what is contributing to lameness on these robotic milking farms? And I could probably answer this quite simply, and that's really mostly things that affect the standing and lying behavior of the cows. And so really no different than conventional parlor milk, freestall type barns. It's really anything that's going to either keep that cow from lying down as long as she needs to per day, or forcing that cow to spend extra time standing in freestall alleys that may be wet, that may be manure laden, which are going to have a negative impact on both, or increase the risk of both infectious and non-infectious foot problems in those cows, and leading to more lameness in those cows. And just as an example, just some of the factors in a couple of the studies that we've done over the years looking at this. This is a study of farms from both Canada and the US looking at association of barn design and lameness in robot farms. And what we found here was lameness prevalence was greater when cows didn't fit in their stalls from a stall width standpoint. So from both a primiparous, so first lactation, and multiparous cows, what we see is that those cows, when they do not fit their stall width, and our simple definition here was stalls were at least twice the hip width of the cows. If they weren't at least twice the hip width, then we saw an associated increased prevalence of lameness in those herds. Similarly, in herds where there was obstruction of lunge space, so which impedes the ability of cows to get up and down in their stalls, which we know is going to have a negative impact on how much time they actually spend lying down, increasing the amount of time cows spend standing outside their stalls. When we say have greater than 25% of stalls with some kind of instruction, we see a greater risk of those cows being lame. So again, a 1.7 times increase. And again, that can be 3-row barns where we've got that outside row that's too short and cows don't have enough lunch space, but it can even be in 2-row barns where we have, say, posts that are, say, situated in the middle of a stall, and that's going to impede the ability of those cows to get up and down well in those facilities. Probably one of the ones that we expect and that we also observed in robot barns is a difference in lying comfort as relates to stall base. And so a higher risk of being lame, 1.6 times being lame when kept in a mattress-based stall versus a deep-bedded sand stall. And again, fairly well researched across all systems. We know deep bedding promotes longer lying times, and we know the benefits of sand from a mastitis standpoint. And associated with that, we also know that to achieve similar levels of lying duration and stall usage on mattress-based stalls, we need to ensure thick levels of bedding on top of those mattresses to get anywhere close to the same level of comfort and minimizing kind of risk of lameness in those herds. One other point which is of interest is the fact that we also see an association with stocking density and lameness. And even though most of our robot farms, again, some of the older data we have would suggest that these farms are undercrowding, we still see a slight linear relationship here between stocking density and lameness prevalence, similar to what we would see in our conventional farms. And even though only a small percentage of farms are overcrowding their cows, we're seeing higher lameness prevalences in those herds as well. Okay, in the last few minutes I have here, what I'd like to do is talk about the final thing, which is improper nutritional management. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, and that's the fact that if we're going to maintain good behavioral patterns overall, whether that be at the feed bunk, the lying stall, or at the robotic milking unit itself, we need to make sure cows have good access to feed, and specifically the PMR. And we typically think, when we think of nutritional management in robotic barns, which is a whole conversation for another day, we typically focus a lot on what feed we're actually providing to those cows in the robot. And again, that does play a significant role in their nutritional management. But just as big of a key piece there is actually the job that we do with their PMR, the partial mixed ration that we provide at the feed bunk. And why that's so important from a behavioral standpoint is the fact that milking times in our robotic barns are typically linked with periods of PMR feeding activity. And again, this isn't just in guided traffic systems where the cows either have to pass from the feed bunk through the robot back to the lying stalls or vice versa, but we also see that in our free traffic systems as well. And this is just one example of that. Some data from an older study of ours looking at the relative frequency distribution of milkings per day. And so this basically kind of gives an indication of when we see at different times of the day peaks in milking activity. And what you see is that this is not a flat line, even though from an ideal standpoint, from a robot efficiency standpoint, it would be best if we could keep this line as flat as possible across the day, meaning that we're trying keeping that robot as busy as possible, avoiding times of cows maybe saying having to line up in queue for access to that robot. One of the things that we notice is that those peaks in milking activity or times when cows are getting to that robot are then also associated with times of, say, feeding management. And in the case of this study here, the two major peaks in milking activity are actually tied to when feed got delivered in the feed bunk. The PMR gets delivered. And so with that delivery of feed and the feeding activity comes also cows on their feet also moving then to the robot. And so we see that association there as well. And in the case of the study here, there was a limited number of feed push-ups, but even with those limited number of feed push-ups, we see slight responses from the cows in terms of them going up to the robot as well. And so it becomes really important from trying to keep that curve as flat as possible or eliminate that curve to make sure that we do a very good job with our feeding management in order to make sure that cows can get to that robot consistently throughout a 24-hour period so we can use that system efficiently as well. Part of the tie there is to the overall behavior of those cows. And I mentioned earlier that we have some interesting tie-ins with not only the feeding behavior of the cows and the milking behavior, but even the lying and standing patterns of the cows in these herds as well. And I like to always go back to this data set as well. So from, again, one of our survey studies where we were looking at robot usage, we're looking at feeding management, and we also put data loggers on cows to look at how long they were spending standing and lying per day. One of the interesting findings was the fact that we saw an association between how much time cows were spending lying down with how often the feed was being pushed up on those herds. And so on these herds, feed was pushed up 8 times a day on average, but that ranged from 2 to 24 times. And with every 2 extra feed push-ups across that range, we see about a 0.1 hour increase in lying duration or associated increase in lying duration. Now, it doesn't sound like a whole lot of time, but if you multiply that out across that range of 2 to 24 times per day, that's about 1 hour difference in lying duration. And that's a significant amount of time that we're basically getting cows off their feet and into their lying stall, comparable to differences in, say, stall comfort, things that we can do, adding extra bedding, all those kind of things, simply by getting the feed available to those cows or making sure that feed is available, having a significant impact on their time budget and potentially then also on their ability to devote time to other things like milking behavior as well. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that we see associations between feeding management and productive outcomes on robot farms as well. And these associations are greater than anything that we actually see in conventionally milked barns. And a good example of that is some data that came out of Minnesota. And again, a survey study looking at an observational study looking at farms in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where they observed a 10-pound or almost 11-pound or 5-kilo difference in milk yield for farms with an automated feed pusher versus those pushing up feed manually. And again, many of you might look at this and say, wow, that's amazing. These automated feed pushers, they're the be all and end all. And yeah, there's probably some reason for that, but it might not necessarily be the technology itself. It might just be the fact that those farms that were pushing up feed manually were just not doing it frequently enough. And I think that's really our take home there, is that we need to be making sure that that feed stays available to those cows. And that's even more important on a 24-hour basis for robot farms, to make sure that those cows stay continually going to the robot, making sure they get up, milk frequently, eat frequently throughout a 24-hour period. And that's backed up again by some of our more recent data from our survey study of 197 farms in Canada. So again, some really new data here. Mean feed push-ups of about 12.8 times per day. And so a lot of producers employing automated pushing technology. And in the case of this study, every extra 5 feed pushes was associated with about 0.77 pounds or 0.35 kilos of milk. And so not as large of a response, but again, nearly 60–70% of our producers are, in this case, using automated feed pushing. And even within that, when we look at the range that we see in terms of how often that's being done, we see greater milk yield with more feed availability, just speaking to the importance of that. And again, we don't need technology, but technology allows us to get there a lot more easily than doing things manually in a lot of situations. So that gets me to the end of my presentation. What I hope to have covered with you today is to touch on the fact that robotic milking presents many opportunities for dairy producers, also for dairy cows. But from a cow behavior standpoint, there may be some challenges that do exist. However, those can be overcome. And so part of that's ensuring cows have the time and desire to milk voluntarily. And that comes with good barn design, good barn management, maintaining good comfort, clean environments from a health standpoint. And then lastly, they're ensuring good feeding management as well. So with that, I thank you very much and hope that we have a few moments for some questions at this time.
All right, thank you, Dr. DeVries. Again, anybody who has any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat box next to the video stream that you're watching right now. I'll go ahead and ask you, I guess, I'll let you put on your time traveler hat, I guess. We are loosely this morning basing a lot of these talks around the idea of automation and technology. And looking forward, looking at the bottlenecks that we have right now with cow behavior and robotic systems, where do you see technology kind of filling some of those gaps in management that we still have? What role do you see it playing?
Yeah, and it's a good question because just as I was kind of concluding, one of the things that we've seen with the benefits of robotic milking is the also or added benefits is the addition of other kind of automated technologies to the barn, right? And so one of the benefits of robotic milking is, yeah, we're not fixing milking schedules, so we can have cows milking at any hour of the day. Well, to do that, we also need cows on their feet at any other hour of the day. With that, we need to make sure we have good feeding management so that gets encouraged as well. So that comes in automated feeding, automated feed pushing, very important there. Some of our work as well, I didn't have time to go through this all today, would suggest that there's also benefits from other automated technologies within the barn. Automated alley scraping, which again is not anything new, but it is something that we do see within the industry and we see as important from a making sure that we're not disrupting normal cow behavior patterns within robotic barns. And then even beyond that, even things like stall management. So automatic bedding systems, stall bedding management, important from not only, again, good cow comfort, but making sure we're not disrupting kind of that normal behavioral patterns of those cows and those systems. And that's something that we observe is that the more kind of behavioral disruption we see, we also see then disruption in terms of their, say, milking behavior as well. And so I think it's kind of all coming part and parcel together as we automate more things that we automate within the barn feed into that and actually help in the overall system. And so again, a lot of that's being driven from a labor standpoint, and I think that's good as well. And we need to be doing that as well. But these things are, and that's kind of the good news story, is that they're also then having a trickle down effect on the cows as well.
Thank you. We have one question from the audience and a couple minutes left before we have to switch to our next speaker. Have you seen an improvement in reproductive performance in robotic systems versus non-robotic systems?
So the short answer is I'm not aware of any direct evidence of that from data itself, and there might be some field data out there that I'm not aware of. That being said, when we did our survey work of producers from a few years back, when we asked them about that question, their perception, and so again, this is producer perception, was that reproductive success was improved. And within that, they cited the use of technology, associated monitors, activity monitors, whether it be pedometers, activity monitors, rumination collars, those kind of things, assisting them in terms of their reproductive management on those farms. And so again, that's a perception that producers have. Whether or not we have direct data to back that up, I'm not specifically aware of at this time point.
All right, thank you.